Choice and Lady Caroline Lamb. So we could perhaps even just move on to him straight away as a living author.
Yeah, I went for Martin Amis. It was actually Laura that got me interested in Martin Amis. The first book of his I read was The Information. I don't know if anybody's read it, but it's a great book. It's a great satire about the vanities of writers and the jealousies and the insecurities and all that. It's hilarious. And I'm sort of in two minds about him because a lot of I don't really believe in his characters very much. They're kind of broad caricatures all the time. But his sentences are terrific. He doesn't know how to write a boring sentence. And he can be very funny. But he's also a terrific critic. Really entertaining. He has high literary standards, but he's not an awful snob. Because he said something about James Joyce once, which I thought was really acute. He said, Joyce could have been the most popular boy in school, but he settled for being the teacher's pet. Which I think kind of sums it up. And he's got this book called The War Against Cliché, which is always his essays and book reviews, and it's really well. This was my toilet book for a while, meaning I probably spent a lot longer in there than I should have, and maybe shouldn't even be sharing that information. But I'm just going to read a few sentences. He's reviewing Hannibal by Thomas Harris, you know, the sequel to Silence of the Lambs, and he's actually a fan of Thomas Harris, but he's not a fan of this particular book. And he says, Hannibal is a genre novel, and all genre novels contain dead sentences, unless you feel the throb of life in such periods as Tommaso put the lid back on the cooler, or Patsy worked like a man possessed, or Margot laughed in spite of herself, or Bob Sneed broke the silence, or Starling looked for a moment through the wall, past the wall, out to forever and composed herself. He looked deep, deep into her eyes. His dark eyes held her whole. And he just rips this apart. And he basically says there's no excuse for writing a dead sentence. You know, you have to bring language to life in front of people. And so I think he would be terrific fun at a book group.
What do you think in terms of how does he carry off being so over the top without it just becoming slightly overplayed?
Well, I think some of it is slightly overplayed, and I think for a lot of people that's the reason why they just... I mean, he symbolises a certain type of writer, which is... I mean, he adores Nabokov. Nabokov obviously is a linguistic genius, and that's what he's setting the bar at, and that's what he's aiming towards. And he's a particular one if you're a Scottish writer, especially if you're a Scottish writer who writes about the working class. He's the enemy, you know? He's absolutely the opposite. Whenever you hear... I remember I invited James Kelman down to Leeds University where I was lecturing at the time, and he was being interviewed by one of the students who was a big Martin Amis fan, and the student made the mistake of bringing Martin Amis up in front of James Kelman, and it was just that was how he was away for about 7 minutes on why Martin Amis represented everything that was wrong with the British literary establishment. So I think his symbol is just that over-erudite, over-educated, showy, stylish sort of teacher's pet.
In Private Eye always used to joke that the book you'll never read is My Struggle by Martin Amis. Laura, you're living author. Is another American female writer, Marilyn Robinson. Can you talk a bit about why you'd want her?
Well, I was introduced to Gilead and Home, and I read them both in quick succession. And I'm not a religious person, but I have to say that these are books that inspired me and made me want to be a better person. Does that sound a cheesy thing to say?
No, not in the slightest.
I thought the sensitivity, the understanding of humanity, and the depth of character. I thought they were both, and I think she would be a very good foil to Muriel Spark because she's kind, she's gentle, she sees the goodness, whereas Muriel's a bit tougher. And I think the two of them would work well together and both draw out the best. I loved both of those books. And actually, I very nearly picked Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale as my book. And there would have been a link there with the whole Gilead thing.
Yeah.
So I'm a bit annoyed that I missed that connection. It wasn't until I saw the big list of all the books. So I should have picked that. But anyway, I think that she would be a terrific book group guest. She might not be hilariously funny or witty, but I think she would bring a real depth of understanding.
And her own books are real book group favourites. I mean, that's something which has only emerged in the last 10 years, books that are best known for being books that book groups like, and both Gilead and Home certainly had that. What do you think it was about the books that appealed to particular book groups?
Well, in my experience, except for the book group that I have at the moment, the book group that I'm working with just now are nearly all men, and that's quite unusual in my experience. I've been in 3 or 4 book groups and they're almost always women. And so I can completely understand why women would love these books so much. They really speak to sort of what women care about most, which is family, and about relationships and miscommunication. And I can understand why women would love those books, and I can completely understand why they would be such book group favourites, because they are so subtle, there's so much to unpack.
Sue, your living choice is a great friend of Alan's living choice.
Coincidentally, yes, we're not in cahoots. I would invite Christopher Hitchens, who is an essayist and polemicist, if that's the right description, and a very close friend of Martin Amis for a very long time. He's also much criticised, again coincidentally, by Marlon Robinson, who's taken great issue with some of Christopher Hitchens' views regarding religion. I'm not a scholar of Christopher Hitchens' non-fiction books. A lot of you here will have read some of his books, but as part of a participant in the Scotsman Book Club, quite recently, because Stuart was part of that reading as well, we were asked to read his memoir, Hitch 22, which was only just this summer, I think it came out, last summer it came out. And I knew Christopher Hitchens by repute. I mean, anybody who happens to have seen him on something like Question Time, you know, will never forget him, because he's so contrary and so bright and kind of plays cognitive acrobatics and can turn arguments on their head. But it really makes you think, and it's very refreshing, I think, today. But I was asked to read his memoir, and it just completely bowled me over. It was beautifully written. There was a huge amount of sensitivity in it, and he wrote, I think, very compassionately about his parents and about his childhood, and that was contradictory, as is the essence of the man. And I would just love to meet him. I think he would, again, have a lot to say about the book that I have chosen. I love the idea of Christopher Hitchens meeting Janet Frame. I wouldn't like us to be in the same group, because I think if he and Martin got together, they would kind of dominate the whole night. But yeah, I think he would bring a great...
What struck me when we did that book group together, because I was more agnostic about the book in some ways, but some of the other participants in the book group detested Hitchens with a passion.
Yes.
You know, they almost found it a sort of personal affront.
Yeah.
Why do you think he creates such really strong opinions? I mean, an otherwise very mild-mannered, in fact, the former Bishop of Edinburgh.
I know, I mean,
wasn't turning the other cheek then.
Well, to such an extent that I found myself saying in this very lofty discussion, I have to say, have you actually met him then? Because it was a very passionate discussion. I think he just touches nerves, you know. I think he tackles such fundamental issues in such a refreshing way that he can unnerve you and perhaps make you have to think in a different way about a whole set of beliefs that you've perhaps vested all your life's choices on. I don't know what it is, but yeah, he just gets to the core of things.
One of the reasons I think he'd be a very interesting person in a book group is he's most famous for changing his mind.
Yes.
You know, he has been seen as a great figure of the left, is now seen as a great figure of the right, or at least the sort of establishment. I wonder if one of the reasons why he'd be such a good person to have at a book group is because he might change his mind during the course of it.
It's a very brave thing to do that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Imagine being the person who's changed Christopher Hitchens' mind. Oh, you could walk tall.
Well, I mean, given it was Osama bin Laden, perhaps not. But you know, that's one of the things about book groups and the whole way they work, that people can change their mind. I mean, in public discourse now, if you change your mind, it's a U-turn and you're a flip-flopper and it's cowardice. And yet, when we're reading, we should constantly be changing our mind, letting the book change us and sort of change our approach to it.
I think it's a very successful outcome if at the end of the book group people say, I'm going to go home and reread that.
Yeah.
And then they can find all the things that other people have talked about that they missed, and that, they came to the book group with the opinion, I don't really like this and this is why. And then they do change their mind in the course of the group.
I mean, that happened to me very recently when I was participating in an event in Fife with the libraries in Fife. I don't know if any of you were at that, but and I'll do a plug here for one of my all-time favourite books, which was by Marlon Robinson, but it was her first book, much earlier than Gilead, which is called Housekeeping, and is a extremely moving and wonderful lyrical book. But not an easy book in many ways, and I was in a workshop talking about that book, and I suppose championing it in a way, and one of the participants in that spoke to me beforehand and said, Sue, I'm really quite worried about this because I hated this book. I really struggled with it. I only finished it because you were coming and I was coming and we were going to be discussing it, and I don't know what I'm going to say. And of course that's fine. As you were saying, that's what we're looking for in a good book group, is that diversity of views. But by the end of it, she said, I've changed my mind. I think I actually love it, So it can happen, and she was going to go off and read it again.
Just to finish off this part of it, I suppose when Sue said that she would choose Christopher Hitchens, I very nearly thought I should say his brother Peter Hitchens, the Daily Mail columnist. We could see which one changed the other's mind.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a very strange individual, but the person I did think about was Zadie Smith. I think her novels are very good. I think they're getting better each time, which is always a good sign in a young writer. But she's just done a book called Changing My Mind, a series of essays. And very like what you were saying, Alan, lots of the editors sent her along when she was a film critic to see things that you just knew were not the kind of film that Zadie Smith would actively go out and see herself. And yet some of the writing is absolutely brilliant in it when she tries to understand these kind of romantic comedies or gross-out comedies or science fiction films. And, I thought what was really moving about that book was that she was always willing to be changed by what she was reading. And she also has a wonderful, wonderful essay called Two Paths for the Novel, where she looks at the kind of broad sweep of contemporary novels and sees two quite distinct, different kinds of novels being written at the moment. And for a book group, that's a really kind of useful thing, just to see what she thinks are the dominant trends. And she thinks on one side you've got people like David Foster Wallace, who are kind of swept up by how mad and surreal and crazy the real world is, where everyone's connected and we're bombarded with information. And she sees people that are sort of trying to deal with this overflow. And on the other hand, there's people who are trying to sort of cut back and have something quite domestic and ordered. It's kind of a battle between order and chaos in some ways.
Maximalism and minimalism.
Maximalism and minimalism. It's a debate that's been going on for a long time in literature. But just to see a writer like Zadie Smith sketch it out, I don't think it's the be-all and end-all that you can say about contemporary literature. But it is interesting seeing somebody say, these are two distinct trends, and these are things that I've noticed and that I have a vested interest in. And I'd heartily commend the book to anyone, Changing My Mind by Zadie Smith.